The gunshot that killed her husband still echoed in Annie Graham's mind 6 months later, though the actual sound had long faded into the dry Colorado air of 1878. She stood at the counter of her modest boarding house in Fort Collins, Colorado, kneading bread dough with hands that had grown rougher and stronger since that terrible day, while her two children played quietly in the corner of the kitchen. 7-year-old Thomas stacked wooden blocks for his sister, and 4-year-old Margaret hummed a tuneless melody that somehow brought tears to Annie's eyes. Every morning she woke wondering how she would manage another day, and every night she collapsed into bed having somehow survived it. The boarding house barely brought in enough money to keep them fed, and the roof needed repairs she could not afford. But when Thomas looked up at her with those earnest brown eyes so like his father's, or when Margaret wrapped her small arms around her legs, Annie found reserves of strength she had not known existed. The sound of boots on the front porch made her look up from the dough. Through the window, she could see a tall man with a worn leather saddlebag slung over his shoulder. Dust covered his dark clothes, and his hat shadowed a face she could not quite make out. Travelers were common enough in Fort Collins, situated as it was along the route between Cheyenne and Denver, but something about the deliberate way this man moved made her wipe her hands on her apron with extra care before going to answer his knock. "Good afternoon, madam," he said when she opened the door. His voice was deep and measured, and his eyes were a startling blue against his sun-bronzed skin. He appeared to be in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. "I am looking for lodging. I was told in town that you run a boarding house." "I do," Annie said, conscious of the flour dusting her dark hair, and the weariness she knew showed in her green eyes. At 26, she felt decades older. "I have one room available. It is $3 a week, includes breakfast and supper." "That would be fine, madam." He reached into his pocket and pulled out coins that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. "I will take it for 2 weeks to start. Name is Blake Coleman." Annie accepted the money, feeling the weight of it in her palm like a small miracle. $6 would buy flour and sugar, maybe even some fabric for Margaret's dresses that were getting too short. "I am Annie Graham. Please come in." Blake Coleman stepped across the threshold, and Annie noticed he moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own body. He was lean but broad-shouldered, and there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested capability. Thomas had come to the kitchen doorway, peeking around the frame with wide eyes. "That your boy?" Blake asked, his expression softening. "Yes, Thomas, come say hello properly." Annie kept her voice gentle but firm. Thomas emerged slowly, Margaret trailing behind him like a shadow. "Hello, sir," Thomas said, with the careful politeness Annie had drilled into her children. Blake crouched down so he was level with the boy. "Hello, Thomas. That is a fine name. And who is this young lady?" "My sister Margaret," Thomas said, gaining confidence. Margaret pressed her face against her brother's shoulder, suddenly shy. "Pleased to meet you both." Blake stood and looked at Annie. "They are good children." Something in the simple statement, the lack of pity or judgment, made Annie's throat tight. Most people in town looked at her with sympathy that felt like suffocation, or with disapproval that a woman her age was running a business alone. Blake Coleman's gaze held neither. "Thank you. Let me show you to your room." She led him up the narrow staircase to the second floor, where 3 small bedrooms opened off a central hallway. The largest she kept for herself and the children. The other 2 she rented out. One was occupied by an elderly clerk named Mr. Peterson, who worked at the general store. The other had been empty for 3 weeks. "It is not much," Annie said, opening the door to reveal a simple room with a bed, a washstand, and a small chest of drawers. "But the mattress is good and the sheets are clean." Blake set his saddlebag on the bed and looked around. "It is more than I have had in a while. I have been sleeping on the ground for most of 2 months." "You have been traveling long?" Annie asked, then wondered if the question was too personal. "From Texas," Blake said. "I worked cattle ranches down there. but I wanted to try something different. Heard there was good land up here in Colorado. Thought I might look into buying a small spread of my own eventually. He turned to face her fully. In the meantime, I need work. I can do most anything. I am good with horses. I can mend fences, repair buildings, handle livestock. Annie's mind immediately went to the sagging roof and the broken gate in the back garden that she had been trying to ignore for months. I cannot afford to hire anyone, she said quietly. I am sorry. I was not asking you to hire me, madam. Just letting you know my skills in case you hear of anyone who needs help. Blake's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested he understood exactly what she was not saying. There is a ranch about 5 miles north, Annie said. The Triple Bar. Owner is a man named Samuel Wright. He is always looking for good hands. I will ride out there tomorrow. Blake paused. What time is supper? 6 o'clock. I will be here. He smiled then, just a slight curve of his mouth, but it changed his entire face. Annie found herself smiling back before she caught herself and retreated to the hallway. The rest of the afternoon passed in the familiar rhythm of work. Annie finished the bread, started a stew for supper, washed the breakfast dishes she had not had time for earlier, and mended a tear in Thomas's shirt. Margaret helped by handing her pins, and Thomas read aloud from his primer, stumbling over words but getting better every day. Annie's husband had believed in education, had taught her to read and figure when they were courting. Now she passed that gift to her children, determined they would have chances she had never known growing up poor in a Missouri farm family. At 6 o'clock, she called everyone to the table. Mr. Peterson arrived promptly, as always, greeting her with his usual courteous nod. Blake appeared a moment later, his face freshly washed and his dark hair damp. He had changed into a clean shirt, she noticed. Smells wonderful, Mrs. Graham, Mr. Peterson said as Annie set the stew pot on the table. Thank you. She served everyone, making sure the children got plenty of vegetables, then sat in her own chair with a weariness that went bone deep. Mama makes the best stew, Margaret announced, and Annie could not help but smile at her daughter's loyalty. It is very good, Blake agreed. He ate with obvious appreciation, and Annie felt an unexpected pleasure in feeding someone who was genuinely hungry. Mr. Peterson picked at his food as always, eating tiny portions that suggested his aging stomach could not handle much more. Mr. Coleman is from Texas, Annie told the children. He has been traveling for a long time. Did you see Indians? Thomas asked, his eyes going wide. Thomas, Annie said warningly. It is all right, Blake said. I did see some Comanche, but they were peaceful. They were just traveling through, same as me. We shared a camp one night, actually. They gave me some dried buffalo meat, and I gave them coffee. It was a fair trade. Were you scared? Thomas asked. Blake considered the question seriously. A little at first, but they were just people, son. People trying to take care of their families, same as anyone. Annie appreciated that answer more than she could say. Too many men filled children's heads with terrifying stories that served no purpose but to spread fear and hatred. After supper, Annie cleared the dishes, while Blake offered to help. She hesitated, then accepted. It was her experience that men who offered to help with kitchen work usually made more mess than they prevented, but Blake moved efficiently, scraping plates and stacking them neatly beside the wash basin. You do not have to, Annie said. You are paying for room and board. I do not mind. My mother made sure all her sons knew how to clean up after themselves. Blake's voice held affection. She said any man who expected to be waited on hand and foot was not worth his salt. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was. The past tense registered immediately. She died 4 years ago. Fever took her. I am sorry. Annie's hands stilled in the dishwater. She knew the weight of that loss, even though her own mother still lived back in Missouri, as far away emotionally as she was in miles. Thank you. Blake picked up a dish towel and began drying the plates she washed. What about you, Mrs. Graham? You have family nearby? No, my husband's parents passed before we came west. My own family is back in Missouri, but we do not correspond much. She did not mention the angry letter her father had sent when she married James Graham against his wishes, or the silence that had followed every letter she had sent since. They worked in companionable quiet for a while. Margaret played on the floor with a rag doll Annie had sewn her, and Thomas sat at the table practicing his letters on a slate. The kitchen felt warmer somehow, more alive than it had in months. Annie tried not to think about how much she had missed this, the simple presence of another adult to share the burden of the day. Your husband, Blake said quietly, his voice low enough that the children would not hear. Was it recent? Annie's hands clenched around the plate she was washing. 6 months ago, there was a dispute over a land claim. The other man was drunk and drew first. She forced herself to keep her voice steady. James was not even armed. He had gone to town to buy seed. Jesus! Blake's voice was rough. I am sorry, Mrs. Graham, that is not right. No. Annie blinked hard against tears that still came too easily. But right or wrong does not change what is. I have 2 children who need me, and I cannot afford to fall apart. That takes real strength. Something in the quiet certainty of his words made Annie look up. Blake's blue eyes held understanding, not pity. She realized he truly meant it. Thank you for helping with the dishes, she said, needing to change the subject before her fragile composure cracked. I should get the children to bed. Blake nodded and hung up the dish towel. Good night, Mrs. Graham. Thomas, Margaret. The children called their good nights, and Blake disappeared up the stairs. Annie shepherded Thomas and Margaret through their bedtime routine, listening to their prayers, tucking them into the small bed they shared. She sat with them until they fell asleep. Thomas's arm flung protectively over his sister, then returned to the kitchen to prepare tomorrow's bread dough. Her hands worked automatically through the familiar motions while her mind wandered. Blake Coleman seemed like a decent man, but she had learned the hard way that first impressions could deceive. James had been decent too, kind and hard-working, and it had not saved him from a drunk man's bullet. She could not afford to trust too easily, not when she had Thomas and Margaret to protect. But as she climbed into her own bed an hour later, exhausted and aching, Annie found herself thinking about Blake's calm presence at her table, the easy way he had spoken to her children, his hands competently drying dishes. For the first time in 6 months, the boarding house had not felt quite so empty. The next morning, Annie woke before dawn, as always. She dressed quietly in the dark room, listening to her children's soft breathing, then went downstairs to start breakfast. The kitchen was cool in the pre-dawn darkness, and she lit the stove with practiced efficiency, measuring out oats for porridge and slicing the bread she had baked the night before. Blake appeared just as the sun was beginning to color the eastern sky. Good morning, Mrs. Graham. I am heading out to that ranch you mentioned. Thought I would get an early start. Sit down first, Annie said. You should eat before such a ride. I do not want to put you out. You are not. Breakfast is part of what you are paying for, Mr. Coleman. She ladled porridge into a bowl and set it in front of him with a jar of honey and fresh bread. Blake ate quickly but thoroughly, thanking her sincerely before heading out. Annie watched from the window as he saddled a sturdy bay horse in the small stable behind the house and rode north. He sat well in the saddle, she noticed, moving with his horse rather than fighting it. The day passed in its usual demanding way. Annie cleaned the boarding house, did laundry, minded the children, and tried to patch a leak in the roof that she could reach from the attic window. She was balanced precariously on the window frame, hammer in hand, when Thomas called up that Mr. Coleman had returned. Annie climbed down carefully and found Blake in the kitchen, looking pleased. I got the job, he told her. Mr. Wright hired me on the spot. Said he needed someone who actually knew horses from the south end going north. Annie laughed despite herself. That is wonderful. I start tomorrow, but I will be back for supper if that is all right. The work is dawn to dusk, but I should make it here by 6. Blake paused. Mrs. Graham, I noticed your roof has some bad shingles when I was riding up. I could take a look at it if you like. I cannot afford to pay you, Annie said automatically. I am not asking to be paid. I am offering because I am living here, and I would prefer not to wake up with rain on my face. Blake's tone was matter of fact. If you have materials, I can do the work on Sunday. If you do not have materials, I can pick some up in town, and you can pay me back when you are able. Annie wanted to refuse out of pride, but pride would not keep her children dry when the spring rains came. All right, thank you. It is nothing. Blake smiled that slight smile again. Now, is there anything you need from town? I am heading back to get some supplies. No, thank you. We are fine for now. After Blake left, Margaret tugged on Annie's skirt. Mama, I like Mr. Coleman. He has kind eyes. Annie smoothed her daughter's soft brown hair. Yes, sweetheart, he does seem kind. That evening at supper, Blake told stories about his first day at the Triple Bar, making the children laugh with descriptions of a stubborn mule that refused to be led anywhere it did not want to go. Mr. Peterson even cracked a smile. Annie found herself relaxing in a way she had not in months, letting the warm conversation wash over her. The days began to settle into a pattern. Blake left early each morning and returned for supper, always offering to help with dishes afterward. On Sunday, true to his word, he spent the entire day repairing the roof. Annie brought him water and a midday meal, and tried not to notice the way his shoulders moved under his shirt as he worked. All finished, Blake announced late in the afternoon. Should hold through any storm now. Annie inspected his work from the ground, then insisted he come inside to wash up. Stay for supper, you must be exhausted. I could eat, Blake admitted. He looked tired but satisfied, and there was a smudge of tar on his cheek that made him look younger somehow. Over the next weeks, Blake became part of the household in small, unobtrusive ways. He fixed the broken gate without being asked. He brought peppermint sticks for the children on Friday evenings. He taught Thomas how to whittle, sitting on the front porch in the cooling dusk while Margaret watched and Annie mended nearby. He never overstepped, never presumed, but his presence filled spaces Annie had not realized were empty. She caught herself looking forward to 6 o'clock each evening, anticipating the sound of his boots on the porch. She noticed things about him, the way he always served himself last at meals, the gentleness with which he handled anything fragile, the patience he showed her children. He had a slow, rare laugh that seemed to come from deep in his chest, and when he smiled at her across the supper table, Annie felt something flutter in her stomach that she had not felt since she was a girl courting James. It frightened her, that flutter. She had loved James with her whole heart, and losing him had nearly destroyed her. She could not afford to feel this way again, could not risk the vulnerability that came with caring for someone. But every evening when Blake appeared, reliable as sunrise, something tight in her chest eased just a little. One evening in early autumn, about 6 weeks after Blake had arrived, Annie stepped out onto the porch after putting the children to bed and found him sitting on the steps, looking up at the stars. The night was cool and clear, and the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. They are brighter out here, Blake said without looking around. Than in Texas, I mean. Annie sat down beside him, leaving a careful space between them. I suppose the air is thinner at this altitude. Maybe. Blake was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Graham, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever think about leaving? Selling the boarding house and going back to Missouri, maybe? Annie considered the question. Sometimes. When things are very hard, I think about how much easier it might be with family nearby. But this is my children's home. James and I built this life together. I cannot just walk away from it, even though it is so hard, especially because it is hard. Annie pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. If I gave up every time things were difficult, what would I be teaching Thomas and Margaret? That when life knocks you down, you should stay down? You are a remarkable woman. Mrs. Graham, Annie felt heat rise to her cheeks. I am just doing what needs to be done. That is what makes you remarkable. Blake turned to look at her directly. Most people would have crumbled. You have kept going, kept your children safe and fed and happy. That takes courage most folks do not have. I do not feel brave, I feel tired. The admission escaped before Annie could stop it. You can be both. They sat in silence for a while, and Annie felt the quiet comfort of his presence beside her. Finally, she said, Can I ask you something now? Fair is fair. Why did you really come to Colorado? Men do not usually leave good work in Texas just to see different country. Blake was quiet for so long Annie thought he might not answer. Then he said, I was engaged to be married. Girl named Sarah. We had known each other since we were children, and everyone always assumed we would end up together. I proposed because it seemed like the right time, the thing I was supposed to do. What happened? About 2 months before the wedding, I realized I did not love her. Not the way a man should love the woman he is going to marry. I cared about her, but it was not enough. It would not have been fair to her or to me to go through with it. Blake's voice was low and steady. So I called it off. Sarah was hurt and angry, which she had every right to be. Her family was furious. My family was disappointed. The whole town had an opinion about it. I needed to get away and figure out who I was when I was not just doing what everyone expected. That must have been hard. Hardest thing I ever did, but it was the right choice. Blake looked at her again. I learned something from it. Sometimes the brave thing is not sticking it out. Sometimes it is admitting when something is not right and having the courage to change course. Annie understood what he was really saying, the gentle wisdom in his words. I loved my husband. I know you did. I can see it in the way you talk about him, the way you are raising your children. That is not in question. Blake paused. But someday, Mrs. Graham, you might be ready to live again instead of just surviving. When that day comes, I hope you will give yourself permission. Before Annie could respond, he stood and bid her good night, disappearing into the house. She sat alone on the porch for a long time afterward, thinking about his words. She did feel like she was just surviving, moving from one day to the next in a fog of exhaustion and grief. But the thought of truly living again, of opening her heart to joy and possibility, terrified her. What if she got hurt again? What if something happened to Blake the way it had happened to James? And yet she realized something had already started to happen. The flutter in her stomach when Blake smiled. The way her days felt lighter when he was near. The comfort of his steady presence. She was not sure she was ready, but ready or not, change was already taking root. Autumn deepened, and with it came preparations for winter. Annie and Blake fell into an easy partnership, working side by side to winterize the boarding house. He sealed gaps around windows while she hung extra curtains. He chopped firewood while she preserved vegetables from the small garden. The children helped where they could, and those long afternoons had a quality of warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. One Saturday in late October, Blake asked if he could take Thomas and Margaret into town for peppermint sticks. Annie hesitated, protective instincts flaring, but the hopeful looks on her children's faces decided her. All right, but hold hands crossing the street and stay where Mr. Coleman can see you. We will be careful, Mama, Thomas promised solemnly. Annie watched them walk down the road, Margaret's small hand tucked into Blake's large one, Thomas walking importantly on his other side. She should have felt anxious, but instead, she felt oddly peaceful. Blake would keep them safe. She trusted him in a way she had not trusted anyone since James died. They returned an hour later with peppermint sticks and news. Mama, there is going to be a harvest dance next Saturday at the church hall, Thomas announced. Can we go? Annie had avoided social gatherings since James's death, unable to face the pitying looks and whispered conversations. But Thomas was looking at her with such hope that she found herself saying, "We will see." After the children ran off to play, Blake said quietly. It might be good for you. And for them, they should have some fun. I am not ready for people staring at me. They will stare more if you keep hiding. Blake's tone was gentle but firm. You have nothing to be ashamed of, Mrs. Graham. You are a widow trying to raise your children and keep your home. That is nothing but honorable. You do not understand how small towns talk. I understand plenty, but you cannot live your life worried about gossip. Those children deserve to see their mother dance and smile. Blake paused. And so do you, Annie. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it on his lips made her breath catch. She looked up at him, and something in his blue eyes made her heart race. All right, she said. We will go to the dance. The week leading up to the harvest dance passed in a flutter of nervous preparation. Annie had not worried about her appearance in months, but now she found herself taking out her good dress, the deep green one that James had always loved, and brushing it clean. She pinned her hair more carefully that Saturday evening, letting a few dark curls frame her face. Mama, you look beautiful, Margaret said, her eyes wide. Thank you, sweetheart. Annie smoothed her daughter's dress, a blue cotton that matched her eyes. Thomas wore his only good shirt and pants, his hair slicked down with water. When they came downstairs, Blake was waiting in the parlor, dressed in dark trousers and a clean white shirt with a string tie. He looked up as they entered, and his expression made Annie's cheeks warm. You look lovely, Mrs. Graham, he said quietly. Thank you. So do you. Look nice, I mean. Annie fumbled the words and felt foolish. Blake smiled. Should we walk? It is a fine evening. The church hall was already full of people when they arrived, lanterns hanging from the rafters, and a small group of musicians tuning their instruments in the corner. Several people greeted Annie with varying degrees of warmth. Some were genuinely kind, others clearly curious about her appearance with Blake Coleman. Annie held her head high and focused on her children, who were already eyeing the refreshment table with interest. Go ahead, she told them. But only 2 cookies each. Blake stayed by her side as Thomas and Margaret darted off. You are doing fine, he murmured. I feel like everyone is watching us. Let them watch. We are not doing anything wrong. The music started, a lively reel that had several couples taking to the floor. Annie's foot tapped despite herself. She had always loved to dance, but it had been so long. Mrs. Graham, would you do me the honor? Blake extended his hand. Annie hesitated. Dancing with Blake would definitely give the town gossips something to talk about. But his hand was steady, and his eyes were warm, and suddenly she did not care what anyone thought. Yes, she said, and placed her hand in his. Blake led her onto the floor with easy confidence. He was a good dancer, she discovered, strong and sure as he guided her through the steps. Annie felt light in a way she had almost forgotten, the music and movement lifting something heavy from her shoulders. She could see Thomas and Margaret watching from the side, beaming with pride. They danced 3 dances before Annie begged for a rest, breathless and smiling. Blake brought her punch, and they stood together watching the other dancers. Samuel Wright, Blake's employer, stopped to say hello and complimented Annie on her children. A few other people made friendly conversation. The evening felt almost normal, like perhaps she could have a life beyond grief and worry. As the night wore on and the children began to droop, Blake offered to walk them home. The moon was bright enough to light their way, and Thomas and Margaret talked excitedly about the music and dancing and cookies. Annie listened to them with a full heart, grateful for their simple joy. At the boarding house, she settled the children into bed, then found Blake waiting on the porch, as he often did. She joined him, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders against the autumn chill. Thank you for tonight, Annie said. I needed that more than I realized. You deserve to have good things, Annie, to be happy. Blake turned to face her. You know that, do not you? I am trying to remember. Annie looked up at him, and in the moonlight, his face was all strong lines and shadows. You have helped me remember. Annie, Blake's voice was rough. I need to tell you something. Her heart began to pound. What is it? I have come to care for you, more than I should, maybe, given our circumstances. But I cannot help it. Blake reached out and gently touched her cheek. You are brave and strong and kind. You love your children with everything you have. When I am with you, I feel like I have finally found the place I am supposed to be. Annie's breath caught. Blake, you do not have to say anything. I know it has not been long since you lost your husband. I know you might not be ready. I just needed you to know how I feel. His thumb traced her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. However long it takes, I will wait. And if you decide you cannot feel the same way, I will respect that. But I had to tell you the truth. Annie stood frozen, her mind whirling. Part of her wanted to retreat, to hide behind her grief and fear. But a larger part, the part that had been slowly coming back to life over these past months, wanted to step forward into this possibility. Blake had been patient and kind. He had helped her without asking for anything in return. He had made her laugh again, made her feel like a woman instead of just a tired widow struggling to survive. I care for you too, she whispered. I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself it is too soon, that I should not feel this way. But I do. Annie! Blake's voice was full of wonder. He cupped her face with both hands, his touch gentle but sure. May I kiss you? She nodded, unable to speak. Blake leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and brushed his lips against hers. The kiss was soft and sweet, nothing demanding, just a question and a promise. Annie felt tears slide down her cheeks, even as she kissed him back. 6 months of grief and loneliness and fear dissolving in the warmth of his touch. When they finally pulled apart, Blake wiped her tears with his thumbs. Are you all right? Yes, I did not think I would ever feel this way again. Annie laughed shakily. I did not think I wanted to. There is no rush, Blake said. We can take all the time you need. But Annie shook her head. I have spent 6 months barely living, just getting through each day for my children's sake. Tonight reminded me that I am still alive, that I am allowed to want things for myself. She looked up at Blake with clear eyes. I want this. I want you. I am still scared, but I am tired of letting fear make my decisions. Blake pulled her into his arms, and Annie rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other under the stars, and for the first time since James died, Annie felt something like hope blooming in her chest. Over the following weeks, Annie and Blake's relationship deepened in ways both profound and ordinary. He began calling her Annie in front of others, and she called him Blake. They sat closer at the supper table, their hands sometimes brushing in ways that made her pulse quicken. On Sunday afternoons, they took walks with the children, Thomas running ahead to explore while Margaret picked wildflowers, and Blake's hand found Annie's. The children adapted to the change with surprising ease. They had always liked Blake, and now they seemed pleased to see their mother smiling again. Thomas asked once if Blake was going to be their new papa, and Annie had said gently that they would see what happened. Margaret just seemed happy that Blake was around more, teaching her songs and whittling her a little wooden horse that she carried everywhere. Annie still had moments of guilt, times when she felt like she was betraying James's memory by loving someone else. But Blake never seemed threatened by those moments. He would hold her and remind her that James would have wanted her to be happy, that loving again did not diminish what she and James had shared. Love is not a finite thing, Blake told her one evening as they sat by the fire after the children were asleep. Loving me does not mean you stop loving him. Your heart is big enough for both. Winter arrived with snow that transformed Fort Collins into something clean and beautiful. Blake helped Annie weatherize the boarding house, and they spent long evenings by the fire, Blake reading aloud while Annie sewed, and the children played with the wooden toys he had made them. Mr. Peterson sometimes joined them, seeming to enjoy the family atmosphere. On Christmas Eve, Blake surprised them all with gifts: a wooden train for Thomas, a doll with a painted face for Margaret, and for Annie, a beautiful shawl in deep blue wool. "I noticed yours was getting worn," he said, and Annie had to blink back tears at his thoughtfulness. She gave him a knitted scarf and new gloves, practical gifts, but made with care. The children gave him drawings they had labored over for days. Blake praised each one sincerely, then hung them on the wall of his room where everyone could see. That evening, after the children were in bed, Blake and Annie sat close together on the settee, the firelight playing across their faces. Blake had his arm around her shoulders, and Annie rested against him with a contentment that felt almost miraculous. "Annie," Blake said quietly, "I have been thinking." "About what?" "About the future, about us." He shifted so he could look at her. "I know we have only been courting a few months. I know some folks might say it is too soon, but I am 30 years old, and I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Annie's heart began to race. "Blake, let me finish." He took her hands in his blue eyes serious and warm. "I love you. I love Thomas and Margaret as if they were my own. I want to marry you, Annie. I want to be a real family, not just a boarder in your house. I want to wake up next to you every morning and work beside you every day and grow old watching our children grow up. Will you marry me?" Annie felt tears spill over. She had not thought she would ever hear those words again, had not thought she wanted to. But Blake had changed everything. He had brought light back into her dark world, had reminded her that life could hold joy as well as sorrow. He loved her children. He made her laugh. He held her when she cried. He was patient and kind, and steady as bedrock. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Blake's face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen on him. He pulled her close and kissed her thoroughly, with none of the careful restraint he usually showed. Annie kissed him back just as fiercely, pouring all her hope and happiness into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "You have made me the happiest man in Colorado. You have made me believe in happiness again," Annie said. "That is no small thing." They told the children the next morning. Christmas Day. Thomas let out a whoop of joy and threw his arms around Blake. Margaret clapped her hands and asked if she could call Blake Papa now. "If you want to," Blake said, his voice thick with emotion. He crouched down to their level. "I would be honored, but I want you to know that I am not trying to replace your father. He will always be your papa, too. I am just hoping to be another person who loves you very much." "Can we have two papas?" Margaret asked seriously. "Absolutely," Blake said. "One in your memory and one here with you. That makes you pretty lucky." Thomas nodded solemnly, seeming to understand. "Our other papa would have liked you. He would be glad you were taking care of Mama." Blake had to clear his throat several times before he could speak. "Thank you, son. That means a great deal to me." They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Fort Collins, with Thomas and Margaret standing beside them, and half the town in attendance. Annie wore her best dress with Blake's blue shawl over her shoulders. Blake wore a new suit that made him look handsome enough to steal her breath. When Reverend Thomas asked if she took this man to be her lawfully wedded husband, Annie said, "I do," with a clarity that rang through the church. Blake's kiss after the Reverend pronounced them married was tender and full of promise. The children cheered and the congregation clapped. Annie felt a sweep of pure joy that she had thought was lost to her forever. The reception was held in the church hall, with food brought by what seemed like every woman in the county. Samuel Wright gave a toast to the happy couple, praising Blake as one of the hardest workers and finest men he had ever employed. Others followed with their own good wishes. Annie was overwhelmed by the genuine warmth shown to them. That night, after the celebration ended and the children were asleep, Blake carried Annie over the threshold of what was now their bedroom. He set her down gently, his hands trembling slightly. I have been waiting for this, he said, but I want you to know there is no rush. We can take our time. Annie smiled and reached up to touch his face. I trust you, Blake. I love you. I do not want to wait any more. They came together with a tenderness that brought tears to Annie's eyes. Blake was patient and gentle, attentive to her responses, making sure she felt safe and cherished. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, Annie felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she was meant to be. Life as a married couple settled into a comfortable rhythm. Blake continued working at the Triple Bar, but now he came home to a wife who greeted him with kisses as well as supper. Annie ran the boarding house with Blake's help in the evenings and on Sundays. Mr. Peterson seemed delighted by the change, often commenting on how nice it was to see the house so full of life and laughter. The children thrived with Blake as a father figure. He taught Thomas to ride properly and to rope fence posts for practice. He played tea party with Margaret and her dolls without a hint of self-consciousness. He was patient with their questions, firm but fair with discipline, and generous with praise and affection. Annie sometimes caught herself just watching them together, her heart full to bursting. Spring came, and with it new beginnings. Annie discovered she was pregnant in early April, and when she told Blake, he picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests that she was too old for such nonsense at 27. You are not old. You are perfect, Blake said, setting her down and placing his hand over her still flat stomach. We are going to have a baby. Are you happy? Annie asked, suddenly uncertain. I know you took on a ready-made family when you married me. I did not mean to add to your burden so quickly. Burdens! Annie, this is a blessing. Blake kissed her soundly. A child that is part you and part me. How could I be anything but overjoyed? Thomas and Margaret were equally excited when they told them. Margaret wanted to know if it would be a sister so she could share her dolls. Thomas asked serious questions about when the baby would arrive and whether he would need to help take care of it. Yes, you will both need to help, Annie said. Being a big brother and sister is an important job. We will be good at it, Thomas said with the confidence of his 8 years. We have had practice. As Annie's belly grew through the summer, Blake became even more attentive, insisting she rest more and taking over some of her heavier chores. He hired a local girl, 15-year-old Rose Miller, to help with the boarding house work 3 days a week, so Annie would not overtax herself. Annie protested that she was pregnant, not ill, but secretly she appreciated the extra help. Samuel Wright, seeing how well Blake handled responsibility, promoted him to foreman and raised his wages. It meant longer hours sometimes, but also more money and security. Blake and Annie began talking about eventually buying a small ranch of their own, maybe in a few years when they had saved enough. I want to build something lasting for our family, Blake said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Something the children can inherit. We already have that, Annie said, placing his hand on her belly where the baby was kicking. We have each other, and we have love. That is what lasts. You are right. Blake leaned over to kiss her, but a ranch would not hurt either. Their son was born in November during an early snowstorm, a healthy baby with a lusty cry and Blake's blue eyes. They named him James Blake Coleman, honoring both Annie's first husband and their new family. Blake held his son with tears streaming down his face, and Annie fell in love with him all over again, watching his gentle awe. Thomas and Margaret took their roles as older siblings seriously, helping to fetch diapers and singing to the baby when he fussed. The boarding house rang with new life and noise, and Annie had never been happier. Winter passed in a blur of nighttime feedings and baby smiles. Young James was an easy baby, quick to laugh and generally content. Blake helped with him as much as his work allowed, getting up for nighttime feedings when he was home and spending his Sundays doting on all 3 children equally. In the spring, Samuel Wright offered to sell Blake a parcel of land adjoining the Triple Bar property, 200 acres with good grazing and a creek running through it. The price was fair, and Blake could pay it off over 5 years while continuing to work as foreman. It was the opportunity they had been dreaming of. "What do you think?" Blake asked Annie after explaining the offer. "It would be tight financially for a while. We would have to be careful." Annie looked around the boarding house that had been her home for 3 years, the place where she had struggled and grieved, and eventually found love again. It held memories both painful and precious, but it was also small and aging, and their family was growing. The thought of a ranch, of wide open spaces for the children to run, of building something new with Blake, filled her with excitement. "I think we should do it," she said. "I think it is time for a new chapter." They sold the boarding house to a young couple from Denver who wanted to try their hand at the hospitality business. Annie helped them learn the ropes, showed them her recipes, and her methods for keeping everything running smoothly. It felt right, passing it on to new hands. In June of 1880, the Coleman family moved to their ranch. It was rough at first, living in a small cabin while Blake and hired men built a proper house. But Annie found she loved the ranch life, loved watching her children run free across the land, loved working beside Blake to build their dream. The house took shape slowly, rising board by board through that summer. It was not fancy, but it was solid and spacious, with 3 bedrooms upstairs and a big kitchen where Annie could cook and the family could gather. Blake built a wide front porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset over their land. Thomas, now 9, took to ranch life immediately, following Blake everywhere and learning to work cattle and mend fences. Margaret, at 6, was more interested in the chickens and garden, but she did her chores without complaint and filled the house with songs. James was walking now, a sturdy toddler who loved horses and got into everything. Annie discovered she was pregnant again in the fall, and this time it felt like a natural continuation of the life they were building. Their daughter, Sarah Rose, was born the following spring, named for Blake's mother and the girl who helped at the boarding house. She had Annie's green eyes and dark hair, and Blake declared her the most beautiful baby he had ever seen besides James. The years flowed by in the way of good years, full of hard work and simple joys. Thomas grew tall and capable, taking on more responsibility around the ranch. Margaret developed a talent for nursing sick animals back to health. James proved to have his father's way with horses. Sarah was clever and determined, the baby of the family but nobody's fool. Annie and Blake added a 4th child in 1883, another son they named Samuel, after Blake's employer, who had given them their start. By then, the ranch was thriving, and Blake had paid off the land early. They bought another 100 acres and began building up their herd. Life was not without challenges. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken equipment, all the struggles that came with ranching. But Annie and Blake faced them together, their partnership strengthened by each trial overcome. On difficult days, Blake would take Annie's hand and remind her of how far they had come. They had. On good days, they would sit on their porch and count their blessings. Thomas grew into a fine young man, serious and steady like his stepfather. At 18, he announced his intention to court Emily Wright, Samuel's daughter, and both families were delighted. The wedding a year later was a joyous affair, and when Thomas brought Emily to live at the ranch, Annie gained the daughter she had always wanted. Margaret surprised everyone by deciding to become a teacher, attending normal school in Denver, and returning to teach at the Fort Collins schoolhouse. She boarded in town during the week, but came home every weekend, filling the house with stories about her students. James and Sarah and Samuel grew into themselves, each finding their own path, but always coming home to the ranch that was the center of their family. The original cabin became a bunkhouse for hired hands. The main house expanded with additions as the family grew. One evening in the summer of 1890, Annie and Blake sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. Their hair was touched with gray now, and Blake's hands were gnarled from years of hard work, but his blue eyes still made Annie's heart flutter after 12 years of marriage. "Do you ever miss the boarding house?" Blake asked, his arm around her shoulders. Annie considered the question. Sometimes I miss the simplicity of those days, but I would not trade what we have built for anything. Not even on the hard days? Especially not on the hard days. Annie leaned into him. Do you remember when we first met? I was so tired and scared. I did not think I would ever feel anything but grief and worry. I remember. You were the bravest person I had ever met, even though you did not see it yourself. I could not have done it without you. You made each day a little easier, until one day I realized I was not just surviving anymore. I was living. Annie took his hand and laced their fingers together. You gave me that gift. You gave me a home, Blake said. A family. A reason to be the man I wanted to be. That is a far greater gift. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. In the distance, they could see Thomas and Emily working with the horses. Closer to the house, James and Samuel were repairing a fence while Sarah supervised from horseback. Margaret would be home tomorrow for Sunday dinner. The ranch was quiet except for the sound of evening birds and distant cattle. Blake, Annie said softly. Yes? Thank you for stopping at my boarding house that day. Thank you for staying. Blake turned to her with that slow, rare smile that still made her breath catch. Thank you for opening the door. Thank you for letting me love you and those children. Thank you for building this life with me. He kissed her as the sun set over their land, over the life they had created together from grief and hope and stubborn determination. Annie kissed him back, grateful for every moment that had led them here, grateful for the love that had healed her broken heart and filled it to overflowing. The night settled soft around them, full of promise and peace, and Annie knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Her love for her children had kept her going through the darkest days, but Blake had made each day brighter until the darkness faded entirely. Together, they had built something beautiful and lasting, a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Blake helped Annie to her feet. Come on, Mrs. Coleman. Let us go see what mischief our children are up to. Annie laughed and let him lead her into their house, into the warm light and noise and love that filled every corner. This was her home. These were her people, and every hard day that had led her here had been worth it. She had survived loss and found love again. She had raised her children and built a new life. She had learned that the human heart was more resilient than she had ever imagined, capable of healing and opening and loving again, even after the deepest wounds. The door closed behind them, but through the windows, light spilled out into the gathering darkness, a beacon of warmth and belonging. Inside, the Coleman family gathered for supper, their voices mixing in conversation and laughter, the simple music of a family that had been forged through hardship and sealed with love. And outside, the ranch stretched away in all directions under a sky full of stars, testament to what two people could build together when they dared to hope, to trust, to love again. Years continued to pass in their gentle, inexorable way. The ranch prospered, growing from 200 acres to nearly 1,000 as Blake acquired neighboring parcels. The cattle operation expanded, and Coleman beef became known throughout Colorado for its quality. Thomas took on more of the daily management, allowing Blake to step back slightly, though he never truly retired. He loved the work too much, loved the land he and Annie had built their life upon. Margaret married a kind lawyer from Denver named Robert Harrison when she was 25, and though they lived in the city, they visited the ranch often with their growing family. James married a rancher's daughter from Wyoming and brought her to work the Coleman Ranch. Sarah surprised everyone by falling in love with a traveling photographer and moving to San Francisco, though she wrote long letters home every week. Samuel, the youngest, showed signs of becoming the best horseman in the family, with a gift for training that brought buyers from across the territory. Through it all, Annie and Blake remained the steady center of their expanding family. They were the ones everyone came home to, the ones who hosted Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, the ones whose quiet partnership showed their children and grandchildren what a strong marriage looked like. Annie's hair turned silver, and Blake's face gained the weathered lines of a man who had spent his life outdoors, but to each other they remained as they had been that first evening when Blake asked her to dance. Blake still looked at Annie with wonder in his blue eyes, still told her she was beautiful, still reached for her hand whenever she was near. Annie still felt her heart flutter when Blake smiled at her, still marveled at her luck in finding love a second time, still thanked whatever providence had brought a dusty cowboy to her boarding house door all those years ago. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1899, their children threw them a party at the ranch. Half of Fort Collins seemed to be there, eating barbecue and dancing to fiddle music. Blake and Annie opened the dancing as they had at the harvest dance decades before, and Annie thought about how much had changed since then, how much they had built together. "What are you thinking?" Blake asked, as they swayed to the music. "That I am the luckiest woman alive," Annie said. "That I have loved two good men in my life, and I am grateful for both. That our children are happy and healthy. That we have built something that will last long after we are gone." "That is a lot to think about during one dance," Blake teased gently. "I am a woman of many thoughts." Annie smiled up at him. "What are you thinking?" "That I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Every moment, every challenge, every joy, as long as it was with you." They kissed, and their children cheered, and Annie felt tears of happiness slide down her cheeks. This life, this man, this family, they were everything she had never dared to hope for during those dark days after James's death. Blake had given her the courage to live again, to love again, to believe in happy endings. The music played on, and the stars came out, and the Coleman ranch glowed with light and laughter. Annie rested her head on Blake's shoulder as they danced, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart. They had weathered storms together, celebrated triumphs together, raised children, and built a legacy together. They had turned grief into hope and hope into joy. As the night grew late and guests began to drift home, Annie and Blake stood on their porch one last time, looking out over the land they had worked so hard to tame and nurture. In the distance, cattle lowed softly. Closer, horses nickered in the barn. The house behind them held their sleeping grandchildren, watched over by their own children. Everything was as it should be. "Ready for bed, Mrs. Coleman?" Blake asked. "Always, Mr. Coleman," Annie replied, and let him lead her inside to the bedroom they had shared for 20 years, where they would hold each other through another night and wake to face another day together. They climbed the stairs slowly, their steps measured but steady, a testament to a life well lived and a love that had endured. In their room, Blake helped Annie with the buttons on her dress, his fingers still gentle despite the arthritis that plagued them both. She turned to face him, placing her hands on his chest. "I love you," she said simply. "I need you to know that. Every single day, I love you more." "I know," Blake said, cupping her face in his weathered hands. "Because I feel the same way about you. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Annie Coleman." They climbed into bed and held each other in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of their home settling around them. Annie thought about the woman she had been when Blake first arrived at her boarding house, exhausted and grieving, surviving each day only for her children's sake. She thought about how Blake had made each day a little easier with his quiet strength and steady presence, until one day she realized she was not just surviving, but truly living again. Her love for her children had kept her going through the darkest times, giving her a reason to get up each morning and put one foot in front of the other. But Blake had given her a reason to do more than just keep going. He had given her a reason to hope, to dream, to open her heart to possibility again. Together, they had built a life richer and fuller than she had ever imagined possible. As Annie drifted towards sleep in her husband's arms, she felt profoundly grateful for the journey that had brought her here. The pain of losing James would always be part of her story, but it was not the end of her story. Blake had shown her that hearts could heal, that love could bloom again even in the hardest soil, that happy endings were possible even after devastating loss. The ranch was quiet under the stars, peaceful and prosperous, a monument to what two people could create when they chose to face life together. Inside the sturdy house Blake had built with his own hands, the Coleman family slept safe and warm. And in the master bedroom, Annie and Blake held each other close, two souls who had found their way home to each other against all odds, and who would face whatever came next, side by side, as they had always done and always would. This was not just survival anymore. This was life in all its messy, beautiful, complicated glory. This was love that had been tested and proven true. This was the happy ending Annie had stopped believing in, made real through patience and courage and the willingness to take a chance on hope. And as she finally surrendered to sleep, Annie smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, and that whatever came, she and Blake would face it together, just as they had faced everything else, with love as their foundation and family as their greatest treasure.